Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share disturbing black-eyed children stories I found on the internet. These stories include two boys who saw something bizarre in the park one night, a woman who had to rush back inside work to avoid two of these beings, a young woman who saw something terrifying on a security camera monitor, and a car ride that takes a creepy and terrifying turn. But first, we start with a young man who had a chilling encounter outside of work one night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had an ominous experience while at work one night that left him with a feeling of dread when thinking about returning there. The original poster, or OP, does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he worked at a 7-Eleven overnight. It was about 2:45 in the morning when the OP was doing his shift change, and as he was finishing up, he heard the store's front door chime. This drew his gaze, but he saw nothing but the open door sliding shut. However, beyond the door, past the pumps, he saw a boy and a girl. He says both children were dressed in normal clothes, with the boy wearing a black t-shirt and the girl wearing a dress with a white top and a black skirt. This confused him as it was now 2:50 a.m. He finished counting the money, and when he looked back out, the children hadn't moved. This is when he started feeling like something was off and a wave of anxiety rushed over him. Even the hair on his arms was standing on end. He walked out front and asked what the children were doing out there alone, but got no response. This, for some reason, sent a surge of fear through him. This was when the girl, who the OP says was about a year or two older than the boy by the looks of it, jumped off the curb before extending her hand to the boy, who jumped playfully off the curb where they were standing. The OP told the children to come inside where it was warm, but as he said this, his body felt like it shut down and he was overcome with a fear like he had never felt. He had to pull himself through the door using the handle, and as soon as he was back inside, the fear completely dissipated. He ran behind the counter and watched this boy and girl approach the store, but lost sight of them and didn't see them again. He was scheduled to work the night that he posted his story and was terrified about the fact he had invited them in, wondering if he was in trouble. He also noticed that his cat had been hissing at nothing while he was home alone. He believes they stopped their approach toward the store because of the lighting in front and how bright it was. He had his boss roll back the camera footage from the night, but he saw nothing on it, making everyone think he was crazy. He knew posting his story alongside other black-eyed children's stories would help because those who have experienced this for themselves would believe him. He ends his post by saying he is worried about going back to work, and the feeling of heading toward his impending doom fills his chest when he does. Even though the OP didn't mention anything about the children's eyes, pretty much everything in this story lines up with what happens in other black-eyed children's stories. Their sudden appearance, standing there not saying a word, the way they are dressed, children being out at that time of night or morning, the fear and anxiety that came over the OP, and their sudden disappearance. When you encounter these beings, you are absolutely not supposed to let them in or invite them into your home. The fact that he told them to come inside the store might have something to do with the fact that he feels an impending doom and dread when he thinks about going back there. The fact that his cat hisses at something that isn't there while he is home alone is concerning too. But usually when people invite these children in, they begin to feel ill and there is a pall that hangs over their home. However, the OP has posted many times since he posted this story and hasn't mentioned black-eyed children again or anything else happening. So hopefully nothing came of his encounter. I know that had to have been terrifying, looking up and seeing those children in the dead of the night and then to experience what he did. He seems to be doing okay though. What do you think about this one? And what would you have done if you looked outside and saw two children standing there in the middle of the night? The next story comes from a poster who had a bizarre experience at a park late one night. The original poster says he has seen a lot of people say black-eyed children aren't real, and he isn't here to convince anyone if they are or not, but he does insist that what happened to him and his friend is a true story. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that he was a junior or senior in high school when his encounter happened. The OP and his friend, who he calls T, had snuck out one night to get stoned. They partook quite regularly and were quite accustomed to sneaking out and walking around the town while smoking. He gives some background information on his town, not knowing if it has any significance or ties to what happened, but says it is an old mining town with some bad history. As they walked at around midnight, they left behind all the active districts in the town and were walking down a road heading to the park, which was their destination. The park was located in a somewhat decent neighborhood according to the OP. As they walked, they laughed and cut up like normal teens, stopping under the one and only streetlight in the area. The light lit up only about 10 feet in each direction. It was then that T stopped, staring straight ahead into the darkness, and asked the OP, "Do you see that?" The OP says he saw nothing there and hadn't heard anything out of the ordinary. T hurried to find and pull out his phone, turning on the flashlight to illuminate something the OP says he will never forget. Directly in front of them on a playset were 3 children. They sat unmoving even when the light hit them, but the OP couldn't see their eyes. His friend told the children they scared them, but there came no reply. The 3 of them just sat there staring at the OP and T. The OP started backing up and told the children bye before he and his friend left. He notes that they heard nothing behind them as they departed, not the children leaving or nothing. There was only dead silence. Upon returning to T's house, it dawned on the OP that it was 1 o'clock in the morning and the children they saw in the park were no older than elementary school age. He ends his post saying he will never forget that night. "I honestly don't know what I would do if I turned on a light in the park in the middle of the night and saw 3 children just sitting there in the complete darkness staring at me. I don't blame the OP for immediately getting out of there. Just like in the first story, there is no clear description of the children's eyes in this one. However, with the OP and his friend being out in the middle of the night with nothing but his cell phone's light, there is a good chance he couldn't really make out their eyes. Also, just like in the first story, the appearance and mannerisms of the children in this story match those of other black-eyed children's stories. Out in the middle of the night, and the way they just sat there staring. Then there is them not responding when the OP's friend said something to them. Luckily, when they left, nothing happened and they weren't followed. I don't know that I'd be going back to that park, especially in the middle of the night. What do you think about this story? Does it make you want to go to the park at night? The next story comes to us from a poster who had what she believes to be 2 black-eyed children try to force their way into where she works. She does not say where her story takes place, just that she worked in an office that mainly handled business-to-business sales and rentals. The office's location was in a bad part of town, and they weren't open to the public, so they kept the front door locked. The only way to open the door was with a key from either side. On the day of her encounter, the OP was about to leave her office on a sales call. The front door was tinted so whoever was on the inside could see out, but whoever was looking in could only see their own reflection. The OP always observes her surroundings before walking outside due to her job's location. When looking, she saw 2 young men walking down the street about a block away. This was no big deal, as she would be able to reach her car before they reached her if they had any ill intent. So she ventured out, but the 2 boys, who looked to be about 15 years old, were suddenly much closer than they had been when she was looking out the door. The OP says here that it was like they covered a whole city block in a split second. This is when her fight or flight kicked in and she went back inside and locked the door. She says she was overcome by an intense fear even though she had no reason to be afraid. She mentions that she isn't even sure how to describe the fear she felt that day. Once she was back inside, the boys approached the door and started banging on it. One of the boys said, "We need a phone, let us in," as they continued to bang so hard that the glass door was vibrating. The OP shouted back no, but they continued to try to get inside. She threatened to call the police, but this did not deter the two boys, who continued to bang on the door while begging to use the phone. The OP then says she gathered the courage to get a closer look at these boys so she could describe them to the police, and this is when she noticed that their eyes were completely black. Even though she is not a religious person, she yelled, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." As soon as the words left her lips, the boys disappeared. The OP says it was like they just vanished. She ends her post by saying she had never heard of black-eyed children before her encounter. This story presents the black-eyed children acting much more aggressively than I've heard in other stories. Granted, I'm still pretty new to this phenomenon, but other stories, they are insistent and pushy about being let inside, but this is the first one I've heard where they actively try to beat down the door. But what they said lines up with what they say in other stories too, with them saying they need to use the phone. This is just one example of the reasons why they need to come into your home or place of work. This is not the first story where I have heard of people invoking the name of Jesus to repel cryptids, creatures, spirits, demons, or the like. This is exactly what I did during my own experience with a demon, and I haven't had any trouble since. These entities fear his name, and with good reason. They are evil with malicious intent. Now, I know a case could be made for some cryptids, as there are stories out there with them actually helping people out. But for the most part, everything I listed is malicious. It only makes sense that they would fear the name of Jesus. This is also not the first story I've heard where someone who isn't religious calls upon his name and is saved from whatever is tormenting them. In any case, I'm glad she was able to do so, as this must have been terrifying, especially with how aggressive these black-eyed children were acting. What do you think about this one? Have you ever called upon the name of Jesus to repel an evil being, or heard a story where someone has? The next story comes from a poster who saw something terrifying outside her friend's house one night. The original poster does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that she was staying at a friend's house after a night out and she had a bit too many drinks to be able to drive home. She notes that her friend has cameras all around his home. She says this happened a while before she posted it, but she remembers it like it happened yesterday. It was about 3 or 4 in the morning and all of the OP's other friends were asleep. She was awake, lying on the couch as her drunken state was wearing off. She was close to falling asleep when she began hearing a light tapping on the door. She stirred from the couch to see what it could be when she heard the tapping again. She made her way to the front door and looked through the peephole to see 2 small children standing there dressed in raggedy clothes. Convinced she was seeing things, she went to her friend's security monitor that showed the view from the front door's camera and could still see the children. She started to go open the door when one of the children looked up at the camera as if they could see her. This is when the OP says her blood ran cold as she saw this child's eyes. They were completely black, no white at all, even where it should have been. He then said, "Can I come in?" The OP convinced herself she hadn't been seen by that child looking at the camera and returned to the couch, lying there listening to the faint tapping until she fell asleep. The next day, her friend woke her up and the OP told him and her other friends what happened. They were all convinced she was just seeing things, as her friend lived in a rural area with the closest neighborhood being about a mile away, and there was no reason for children to be out that late. The OP agreed but insisted she saw something and told them to check the cameras. Her friend who lived there did as she asked, but the camera facing the front door shut off right around the time in question. However, another camera clearly saw the OP looking at the monitor in bewilderment. She ends her post saying she isn't usually one to believe in these kinds of things, but she knows what she saw and she has no logical explanation for it. I'm pretty sure the last thing I would want to hear at my door at that time of night would be a light tapping. Then to look through the peephole to see two children standing there in raggedy clothes. Now, my first thought before hearing about black-eyed children would be to open the door and try to help them. But imagine looking at the monitor to ensure yourself you are in fact seeing what you're actually seeing and having a child with black eyes look seemingly directly at you. Then ask if they can come in. I honestly don't think I'd look through my peephole ever again. I don't blame the OP for leaving the door and going back to the couch. Honestly, it was the best thing she could have done. Even if she had opened the door, as long as she didn't give these beings permission to enter the home, she would have been fine. But ignoring them seems to be the best course of action. What would you have done if you looked through your peephole to see two children standing there that late at night? Then to have one look at the camera and seem to be looking directly at you. The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw something very strange and terrifying one morning when her mother gave her a ride to school. She does not say where her story takes place, just that she lived in a very small neighborhood she describes as more of a glorified cul-de-sac, with one more like it in the proximity, and homes here and there with nothing in between but long rural stretches. The OP's encounter took place when she was either a freshman or sophomore in high school. She had missed the bus, and being that she didn't yet have a car, her mother gave her a ride to school. She mentions it was still dark out and a very cold morning. Just as she and her mother were pulling out of their neighborhood, they both see three children standing on the sidewalk, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, with all three of them wearing blue and white private school uniforms. She believes there were two girls and a boy, but says she cannot remember exactly, and it could have been two boys and a girl. In any case, she says the girls were wearing blue and white dresses while the boy had on a short-sleeved blue shirt and khaki shorts. She points out here how weird their attire was, being that it was about 40 degrees outside and they weren't wearing coats or anything else to keep them warm. She also noticed that there were only two schools in the area, but neither was a private school. In fact, the closest private school was in the next town over, and the school's colors did not match those the children were wearing. The thing she found the weirdest about the children, though, was that they were standing side by side completely still. This was absolutely unlikely at the age these children appeared to be. What made the scene even creepier was that there was no street light or light of any kind where the children were standing. They were just standing there, completely still, shoulder to shoulder, in the dark. They stood on the side of the street closest to the passenger side where the OP was sitting. And of course, she and her mother had to turn right, putting her that much closer to them. The OP says she at first couldn't see their faces due to it being dark and the shadows created by the car's headlights, which only lit them up from the neck down, and why she remembers their outfits so vividly. But when the headlights eventually did light up their faces, she was horrified to see that their eyes were completely black. They had no white in them whatsoever. Her mother noticed this before she did and gunned it, speeding away from the children as quickly as possible. The OP tried to turn back to see if the children were still there, but it was too dark. Her mother did not return home until the sun had come up and everything was bright enough that she wasn't scared. The OP shared her story at school, but no one believed her, and when she and her mother told her siblings what happened, they thought they were messing with them. However, she says they both know what they saw, but they never saw the children again. At the time, the OP believed she and her mother had seen three ghosts standing on the side of the road, but she later learned about black-eyed children on YouTube and made the connection. Not long after her encounter, her family moved away and she had forgotten about the whole incident until her mother brought it up one night. This not only reminded her of her terrifying event, but has once again instilled within her the fear she felt that morning. This might be one of the most bizarre black-eyed children stories I've heard, with them standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder, without moving. It is something straight out of a horror movie. Well, to be honest, almost every encounter with these beings is like that. And to see them standing there wearing school uniforms that don't match any close by. I would have thought I was looking at ghosts too. The OP mentions how scared she was in the comments, having to relive that, and I don't blame her. However, I wouldn't worry about getting another visit from these children, being that she and her mother didn't interact with them and drove away immediately. That and the fact that they never saw them again. Still though, it isn't something I'd like to think about or remember either. It must have been terrifying to go from seeing a confusing, creepy sight like 3 children standing there in the dark to seeing that their eyes were completely black. The mother absolutely did the right thing. Another thing that adds credibility to this one for me is that the mother not only saw them too, but brought up the encounter years later. Sometimes in these stories, people either block it out or just weirdly forget. I've heard stories where 2 people see something, then one completely forgets about it later on. And it isn't a situation where they just refuse to talk about it either, because I've come across those too. But this is something different, where they either block it out or don't remember for some reason. It's a good thing the OP has her mother to talk to about this if she ever needs someone to listen to, especially with no one else believing them. What would you do if you were driving in the dark and saw children standing creepily on the sidewalk, not moving? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.